how was the writings canonicity discovered? Now, I would love to tell you that we have a rabbi, or we have a collection of rabbis during this time period who sat down and answered this question for us. Unfortunately, we don't have that. And I would love to tell you that we have a church father sometime in this time period that sat down and wrote, here's how we discovered this book was canon. Unfortunately, we don't have that. So what we've had to do is a little bit of detective work. We've had to look at why we think the Jews accepted the Old Testament books as Scripture, and we've had to look at what do the church fathers, what do the apostolic and post-apostolic fathers say about the Scriptures? What can we infer from that? And that's what these next couple qualifiers are. And I have to say that not all qualifiers match exactly. They're not a in-out, pass-fail sense, because we have to determine who the author is. We have to determine what it was written for, and was it written with authority, and things of that nature. And that leads us to our first one. Was it written by a prophet? And here we can use this for both the Old Testament and the New Testament, because we see in the book of Acts that prophets played a role in the church. What role exactly did they play, and how did that prophetic gift work? Those are a little bit of mystery, but sometimes we can see Peter and Paul and John and so forth doing what we usually refer to as prophecy, in the sense of prophecy is a prediction of something to come. But that's not the best way to describe the New Testament as a whole. It can also be, was it written by an apostle? Now that right there should raise two books right off the top of your head. Wait a minute, what about Mark and Luke? Mark's not an apostle, Luke's not an apostle. Why do they write? And why do we then accept them if they're not written by apostles? We have very early church writing that tells us that Mark wrote Peter's gospel. And here's where we have a little bit of we don't know what to do with this. One source very early tells us that this happened while Peter was alive. Another source tells us that it happened after Peter died. What we can take away from that is both sources say that Mark wrote Peter's gospel. Did it happen while he was alive, or did it happen after he had died? We're a little unsure about that. But one of those sources also tells us that Luke wrote Paul's gospel. So we have Mark and we have Luke, not apostles, but associates of apostles. And that leads us to, was it written by a prophet? Was it written by an apostle? Or was it written by a close associate of an apostle? We also have one more qualifier of this. Was it written by an amanuensis? And I have no guarantee that I'm pronouncing that word correctly. Was it written by an amanuensis or a scribe? A scribe of an apostle. Now, I wanted to find this. I absolutely loved this video clip I watched one time. It was an interview, and it was an interview with an atheist interviewing a scholar, and this scholar was not an evangelical, he was not a conservative. I want to say it was Bart Ehrman. I can't guarantee it was Bart Ehrman, but I think it was Bart Ehrman. And anyways, they're discussing the writing of the New Testament, and the atheist refers to one of Paul's books, and I want to say it was Romans, and says, well, did Paul even write that book? And you could hear the scholar say, that's not one of the questioned Paul epistles. We're all sure that Paul wrote that book. And the atheist then says, well, what about a scribe writing this? And you could hear the scholar like holding back his you poor person. In the ancient world, when a scribe wrote for a person, it was still the person's writing. That was very common. We don't really question it in that way. And you could just hear the atheist's embarrassment at that point. And again, I wanted to find that clip. I couldn't find it this morning for you. But we have a couple amanuensis or scribes noted in the actual text. In Romans chapter 16, verse 22, we have Tertullus, or some other pronunciation of a Greek name, being our actual scribe writing down. I do not envy a scribe trying to write down Paul, in the sense that it's even hard to read Paul, because Paul gets on these long rants and then he comes back, but sometimes he doesn't come directly back. He saves that for later, and there is the scribe. You're probably like, I quit. We also have a scribe mentioned in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 12, that is Silvanus. And one of the objections to Peter being the author of 1 Peter and 2 Peter is 1 Peter's Greek is much better. The Greek in the second letter of Peter is so different from the first letter that it can't be Peter writing it. Or perhaps Silvanus wasn't available to write that letter, and perhaps he had to use a different scribe to write that letter. Just saying. And that would make sense. Who was Peter? Peter was a first century Jewish peasant fisherman. Is it possible that Peter didn't even know how to write Greek? It's possible that Peter didn't even know how to write Greek, and so he had to rely on amanuensis to write those things. Is that also the answer to the mystery about John? The Gospel of John is written in such perfect Greek, and the book of Revelation is written in a kind of sloppy Greek. Could it be that John had an amanuensis, or another kind of scribe, when he wrote his Gospel, but while he was on the island of Patmos, he had to rely on his own Greek? Could that be an answer to why those two books say that they're written by a John, and yet their Greek is so different? It's a possibility.